Okay, so I wanted to start off by thanking you for inviting me, Tony and Ray, and also my colleague, Greg Newby. We're really happy to be here. We had an opportunity to come out early and meet with a number of you about possible research collaborations. We were grateful for that, and we've been very happy to be at the session. Everything okay? All right. So as you've heard, I'm at the Center for Advanced Study of Language. And when I got to CASEL, we call it CASEL for short, I was asked this question. Could I lead some research to, just address this general question, how can we get more people to level 3 and level 4? So I want to thank Jim very much for talking about what level 5 is like. Level 4 is close to that. It's very difficult. And when we started thinking about this question, we met with people from the Foreign Service Institute and across different government agencies to find out, well, what does that mean to be at a very advanced level? In the university world, advanced means something very, very different from what it means in the government. In the government, we're talking about professional level, and we've seen some really high levels of that. But level 4 and level 3 are also much higher than you typically get in universities. So that was something that I really needed to learn since I came out of a university setting. Got together some researchers from different fields, second language acquisition, cognitive psychology, linguistics, people from the government. Jim wasn't there, but some of his colleagues were. And we said, well, one answer to that question is ATI. So what is that? Aptitude by treatment interaction. Aptitude, as you'll see, is talent for language learning. Treatment is instruction or some other way of making language learning happen, and interaction is how do those two go together. So I'm going to talk a lot about that, but I'm going to call it tailoring training. ATI is what's used in the general literature. I might slip and say ATI because it's just really short and easy to say, but the idea is to tailor the training. So here are my key points. I just added that little graphic because yesterday I was feeling a little bit like a fish out of water in the Humanities Plus. But then I was thinking about it through the day, and I'm really not that far out of the water. And we're going to do a deep dive into some of the things that I do, and I think we're going to see that although we focus on the science of language at CASEL, the abilities that we're looking at and measuring are relevant to the kind of things that we're trying to find out about what's so special about humanities skills that could be useful. But these are my key points for today. Tailoring makes language learning more effective, so faster and with better results. By the way, these are not new ideas, right? Teachers know this. What we're just saying is that we can provide some kind of data that teachers can't get right up front. It might take them a year to find out, and they might not ever be able to find out some of the things that we're offering to tailor the training. And so I'll be talking about these kinds of individual differences and how to measure them objectively, calling it cognitive aptitude. I'll explain that in a minute. And we're going to say that this is going to inform how we tailor training. This is a really, really hard problem that we're working on, but it's a lot of fun to work on it. Cognitive aptitude itself can be trained. I'm not going to talk about that extensively, but I wanted to make sure that you understood that, and if I don't come back to that at the end, remind me. And tailoring can be accomplished at all different levels, so I'll try to show you that. At the program level, in classrooms, and maybe most promisingly online in a new initiative that we have called Language Nation. One of the problems with tailoring is that it's very intensive, and so if we can automate it, then that would be great. So what is the problem? Why is it so difficult to learn a language? I'm speaking to the people who already know this. It's the question, we mentioned this yesterday, we still are not learning language when it's easy, so we make it hard for ourselves. This is just stylized, but this is the empirical findings. These are the empirical findings that it's easy to learn a language when you're a child. And then right around the age of more or less 15, 12, 15, that's just a range, you can no longer explain outcomes by age of first exposure. Whereas early on you can. If you get exposure to a language, you keep getting sufficient exposure, you're going to learn it. Okay, but look at this. We have people who do well, and we have people who do very well. So these are the people that we're trying to find when we're talking about aptitude. We're talking about aptitude. With my research question, how do we get more people to level 3 and level 4? We thought, okay, let's look for people who have an excuse me, talent for this. I better grab some water. Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. This happens to me when I get excited. Okay. So, you all also know this. There are many factors that predict language learning success. And so I need to mention that what we're focusing on when we're looking at high-level learning is we're saying that the motivation, personality facets, and experience are already at their optimal level. People in the government told us that this was the case for people that they wanted us to work with. People, excuse me, very sorry. That those were not the issues. That the issue was, even when all those things were lined up, people were still having a hard time. Okay, I have to go through this quickly, sorry, because I have a lot of things I want to introduce you to. So what part of all this does language aptitude actually explain? One is some of our older tests explain speed of language acquisition under intensive learning conditions. These are your MLAT and your DLAB tests that you're familiar with. And this is typically up to level 2 on the ILR scale. Whatever you think of the ILR scale, and I'm really pretty much in line with what Jim was talking about, they're still useful ballpark numbers. So level 2 is just very basic general proficiency. What we're doing at Castle is we're trying to look at ultimate attainment, which is the ceiling on how far you can go, and the cognitive processes used in learning. And this is what I'm going to focus on today, aptitude profiles. We're also looking at specific language features, so I just threw that up there. I'm not going to talk about that today. I threw this slide back in because of the hurdles analogy that we saw. When we said we wanted to do ATI to get more people to level 4, we didn't think about developing an aptitude test, but we were kind of forced into it. Because, as I just showed you, MLAT and DLAB don't really measure the things that we think are important in very advanced language learning. But we did take the very same approach that people have done in developing the Modern Language Aptitude Test, John Carroll, and the DLAB. And that is to look at general cognitive ability first. So we're predicting learning of some kind, right? Typically in a classroom, but sometimes outside the classroom. And general cognitive ability helps you learning anything, okay? So you have to look at that first. And this may be a good area to look at humanities skills and abilities that are separable from language. Then there's language aptitude, so obviously that's a humanities ability that we have. And then there's the specific aptitude. So when you develop a test, you try to separate these things out and see what's contributing what. Another way to look at it is, we were saying, well, what should go into HiLab? So we put in nonverbal IQ. So IQ is just a shorthand for cognitive ability. So for example, there's something called nonverbal logical reasoning. And there's also verbal IQ, verbal logical reasoning. So those are things like how can you figure things out? How can you follow a logical argument? How can you follow a sequence? Things like that. And above and beyond those things, are there other components of language aptitude? So again, I said, yeah, I'm feeling like a fish out of water. So let's think about this in terms of why are humanities skills useful? there is some overlap in the cognitive constructs that I'm talking about. And some of the things that don't line up with language aptitude are the kinds of abilities that I heard people talking about yesterday that they want in the workplace that are separate from pure language aptitude, but they're important abilities to have. So we did a study. We did a lot of work, I should say that quickly, on HiLab. The test is a little bit different from other aptitude tests. It's a direct measure of cognitive abilities. So instead of paper and pencil multiple choice, we have people engage in cognitive tasks that measure these things. And I don't have a lot of time to talk about this today because that's really down in the weeds, a really deep dive. But if anybody's interested, I can tell you about these things. The first problem we encountered was that when you give a direct measure of aptitude, what happens, we heard about reliability in the previous presentation, the reliability of the measure goes way down because those measures delivered on a computer, asking somebody to do something that engages their cognitive attention. First of all, you have to make really sure that people understand what they're doing, because if they don't understand the goal of the cognitive task, they can do it differently. So you have to constrain them, and then also they can be distracted. It's very difficult to do. So we worked for several years on getting reliability of the measures, which we have established now. And we're working on the validity now. One way of looking at validity is to say, okay, do these things factor separately when you do a factor analysis? What loads together in a factor analysis and what is separable? Because the bottom line is we started with 7.5 hours of measurement, cognitive tasks that took 7.5 hours to do, and we have no clients who will do 7.5 hours worth of testing. So we have gotten it down. One test that we really like, it's 3 hours. You can break it up, and that seems tolerable. We have another client that says we are not going over 90 minutes. Okay, so it's important to look at all these factors. And so what happened, I'm going to show you another way of looking at this, but what happened that was really interesting for those of you who are interested in aptitude, all of the Carroll factors, we call them that, on MLAT loaded together. So that was fascinating, because every time we look at these old tests, MLAT and DLab, they did a good job developing those tests. They do have predictive validity, they make sense when you do factor analysis, and so forth. It's just that with HiLab, we're kind of going above and beyond because we're asking for a different prediction. So some of the things you can see. The other thing, does this have a pointer? Well, anyway, up at the top, nonverbal IQ, nonverbal logical reasoning, we call that intelligence. And what they call it now is fluid intelligence. It's the kind of intelligence that's native, or it's your talent. It's not your acquired crystallized intelligence. That's a separate factor, which is a good thing. One of our clients already measures that. And then all the Carroll factors came together. There's a logical reasoning component there, which we have in the big HiLab, but our client measures, the one who wants the 90-minute test measures that, so we can use their data and thereby shorten our test, just to give you an idea of the kinds of things we're doing. The other factors are new to HiLab. Executive control, which is part of the working memory system. I'll show you how that works in a diagram in a minute. Things measured there, inhibition, updating, task switching. What do you keep in your working memory limited capacity, and how do you pay attention to that input when you're trying to process language data in order to get it into your long-term memory? So this is all about what goes on during learning. Processing speed, how fast is your brain? Phonological acuity and processing, I think you can get what that is. How can you distinguish sounds in language in light of having a phonological system from your first language or maybe from several languages? And then finally, something called priming, which is a measure of implicit induction. Basic idea is that explicit induction is you're intentionally trying to figure out the patterns and systems of language. And implicit induction is you're not intentionally trying to do that, but you're doing it. And this is different from deduction. A lot of language teaching is deductive. Here are the rules of language, learn them. So we're kind of saying we don't think that's useful, especially at high levels. Things you need to learn are not things that people can describe, at least as rules. So these are the constructs that we built in. So sorry this is so quick. I can go on about this for hours if you like, but we don't have time today. So we could put this into a model, and we do model this. So you can see the working memory system here. It's all measured there. And then these are just paths to say what's important to what. I put the DLPT on the right-hand side as our outcome measures, but as we heard from Jim, these are not really the best outcome measures for what we're looking at because the level of granularity is not matched. The other thing is you can see we have pragmatic discourse sensitivity and speech planning. That's what Jim was talking about. And those things are still under investigation because they're very hard to measure. Someone said, how do you measure those things? We have to do the basic research. What is pragmatic discourse sensitivity? So Jim has some ideas from the practical work that he's done. What would be a measure of that is the question. So I didn't have this slide before, but I wanted to let you know that because we're predicting high-level ability, we haven't forgotten about this. And in fact, it was someone from FSI who mentioned the idea of fluency. Ray was talking about it too, like automaticity, like really being able to do it under pressure. So those are kind of in the works, but not in high lab yet. Okay, so how are aptitude tests used? There are many ways, as I'm sure you know. One of them is selection. That's one of our primary uses and why we had to work so hard on the reliability of the measures. Jim mentioned when you have people, when you give a test or you make a judgment about someone in the workplace, you might have a lawyer coming immediately if you're saying, I didn't get this job because of your test. Okay, but I'm not going to talk about that use today. That's a very high stakes use. High lab can do that because we reach the level of reliability that's acceptable in the human resources world. But today I'm going to focus mostly on tailored training, aptitude by treatment interaction. It's much lower stakes. If you make a mistake, there's not a problem. You just try again. And cognitive training. Okay, so just once again to remind you what is cognitive language aptitude, what does high lab measure? Just reminding you because I've shown you this a couple times already. What does it look like? This is also, we're pretty proud of this, a lot of work. We started out standalone computers or laptops with a button box over there in the right-hand corner. It's great for developing a test. It's really difficult for administering tests because we really want web delivery. And so we've just finished porting high lab over to the web. If anyone wants to try it, let me know. We've developed a version for the Foreign Service Institute. They're helping us pilot the web version right now, and for other clients. And it's on CRO, which is Castle Research Online. That is a whole suite of cognitive measures, aptitude and other measures, general cognitive measures, which I hope I remember to go back to at the end. So this is, again, representing a lot of basic research and development, but now we're at the point where we're implementing high lab for tailored training because it's easier. But we're not over the hurdles yet. Keep an eye on the time here. Because we have to communicate this information. So it's not like you can say, you got a score of 100 on D-Lab, and so you can go to DLI. You got a 110, so we're going to put you in a category 4 language. We don't have scores like that. We have things like, your reaction time is this, or your accuracy across times is that, time trials is that. We have to interpret this information, both for ourselves. So one question we have is, what is exceptional ability in these cognitive tasks, truly exceptional ability? What does that mean? That's a research question. And then how can we communicate it to other people? So these are our questions that we're focusing on. I already went through how are the abilities structured, how do they interact with training, but how can we communicate it? We can't be there every second and say, okay, here's how you tailor the training. We have to make this accessible to teachers and ultimately even to learners. We heard about learners who can self-assess. We've interviewed people, again, from the Foreign Service Institute, from the FBI, who are simultaneous interpreters, and intelligence analysts who are at the very highest levels, you know, the people who know 11 languages and on and on. So they really know what they're doing in language learning and what they need to do. They can articulate. So at that level, I think a learner could even use this information. But certainly curriculum developers and teachers would be your first step at the lower levels when learners don't know what they need, and then learners themselves later on. So we start out by just, you know, reporting the scores. We thought, okay, well, at least we could report percentiles. So these are all our tests. The tests themselves, you know, you saw the names of the constructs. What are we measuring? Working memory, and then we have a number of tests. So that looks like pretty meaningless, right? We showed this to our very first client, and they said, what? What is this? We want you to, this particular client wanted us to make a decision. Tell us which one of our newly hired people should be sent to language training first. Who has the most promise? You make that decision for us. So we had to think of a different way of presenting the data. So this is what we did for them. We made that decision. We said, okay, for the people who came, according to the way we currently interpret our data, which is very tentative because at that point we only had 100 people to compare them to, and those 100 people were already very good language analysts. They weren't the general population. You have 6 people who look exceptional in that group. Send them to language training first. So they really liked that. And they liked just the overall percentile. But then here, it gets a little harder. We kind of said, let's give names. You can't see this, but let's give names here that make more sense than the names of the tests. I think on the next slide you can see it a little bit better. Look, yeah. So the names of the tests are learning foreign sounds, multitasking, things that might make more sense on a general level, although we found out that it wasn't good enough, but we tried. So we took the actual tasks, sometimes we combined the scores, and we gave a profile. But this kind of did work for them. Active memory and processing is the top, foreign sounds, implicit learning, explicit learning. If you have a blue bar in all of those, you get called exceptional. This is still an empirical question, but I think it's a good guess. So that's what we did for one client. Then we have pros that has to do with questions they have, which are who should go to training and who would do well in an immersion. So we kind of interpreted the data from the tests, and we said, well, okay, which of these aptitudes that we're measuring might be relevant to going on an immersion or going to language training first. And so we wrote pros, and nice thing is that this is all automatically generated. So once you figure out your algorithm, you don't have to write the pros each time. But as soon as you have a different question from a different client, then you have to do it again. Okay, so now we're trying again. We're working with the Foreign Service Institute. This is a very new collaboration, which just started in December. And they would like us to put another layer of interpretation, one that we try to do verbally, but they would like to see it in the card. What does all this mean for language learning? How can we tell people what they're doing? So who's looking at this? Language learning consultants, who are people that the learners, these are typically high-level learners, but not always. There's a range of learners. And then maybe teachers, but we're not sure about that yet. But certainly the learning counselors and the learners themselves, who, for the most part, are very experienced language learners, even if they're not at the highest levels. Most people I've met so far are not learning a language for the first time. They know several languages, so they may be able to use this information. So what we did was to say, okay, what things are important in language learning? Input, you all know this, interaction, and feedback. Feedback on error is what we mean, or not mistakes like we were talking about earlier, but systematic error that you might want to provide feedback on. We broke that down. I'll show you one example, but if anyone's interested, I can show you more. Input we broke down into variability, authenticity, pattern learning, and so forth. And then interaction, we looked at switching between languages and scaffolding. How much help do you need? Jim was showing us some scaffolding when he was dealing with the Russian text that was difficult. He was helping us. That was scaffolding. Thank you for showing that. And feedback on error going from implicit to explicit. A recast is simply you hear your interlocutor say something that's incorrect or you didn't understand. Well, actually, if you didn't understand, you can't do a recast, but you understand, but then you provide the correction, but you don't say anything about it. You just said, oh, you repeat it, but with the correction. Error identification, you might just say, oh, you know, you didn't say this correctly, but you don't go into a long discourse about it. Explanation is pretty self-explanatory. Okay, so that's the front page. And then we break each, oh wait, I wanted to say something else though, sorry, about the way that we present the results. So now we don't see scores and we don't see names of tests or anything. We just see continua. Now these are definitely works in progress together with FSI learning counselors. But they do a lot of things on continua. And this is actually how we think of aptitude as well. It's not that you're good and bad, although in some sense there is an absolute high and low. Sometimes people do have very low aptitude for language learning and very high. But especially for the aptitude by treatment, interaction, or tailoring, the idea that people are different is more important. And so we're trying to work on these continua. I think they still kind of reflect a high and low too much, but we're working on it. And then we add together some of the scores and we put a dot on the continuum. Yeah.
On the feedback, I didn't quite understand. The feedback involves two individuals?
Yeah, that's...
Okay, so it's not self-feedback,
It's right. It's, oh, yeah, maybe our graphic isn't... So you said something and then your interlocutor gives you feedback on it. It doesn't have to be an individual though, as we'll see later. Maybe it could be a computer.
So feedback is a kind of interaction?
Yes, it is, definitely. It's specifically targeted toward errors. And teachers do this without training, and everyone who's at a higher linguistic level than someone else does at least the implicit type of feedback on error all the time. There's tons of research showing that, which is where actually the technique came from. So parents do it to children, children do it to siblings and so forth. They don't say, you said that wrong and here's how you say it. They just reformulate it. And the interesting thing is that people know that everyone, the lower proficiency people notice the recast. And there's evidence for that.
Between different cultures? Or is this just within...
That's a good question, between different cultures. I'll have to think about that. Yeah.
Feedback,
Yeah.
say in Japanese or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
Probably not becoming that way.
Good question. Okay, so let me just break down one of them. It happens to fit with what Jim talked to us about. One of the principles of second language acquisition is that you need input variability. So he was talking about exposure to a wide range of registers, genre, tasks that you have to do in the language, all kinds of things. It's really important. That's just a known factor, and it's an SLA principle. So what we did was we just write this out. We explain why it's important, different kinds of texts. We tried to put it in language that makes sense to the consumers. And then we say high lab measures inhibition control and phonemic discrimination because we think those are important aptitudes for dealing with the variability. So why would we want to think this way? Well, we also know a general learning principle that says that when you're learning anything complex, all human beings benefit from systematicity first. But after that, there will be varying points when people can handle the variability. So it would be helpful to know when people should begin encountering the variability. For some people, this might be later. You need systematicity for longer or maybe all the time. You still need exposure to variability, but in a very systematic way. If you have an aptitude or a talent for this, you can be exposed to authentic material right away without any help. And if we don't give learners this kind of material, we're holding them back. So that's the idea of ATI, tailored training. Match the training to what the person needs, and they're going to do their best because you've matched the training. A lot of people ask us, isn't tailored training or aptitude by treatment interaction, somehow inequitable? It's a natural response. But we usually try to explain, well, actually it's the other way around. If you don't meet the person where they are, then that's what's inequitable. Language learning is not one size fits all. Any kind of learning is not one size fits all. Okay, so now let's get into the practical implementation. What are we using HiLab for? As I mentioned, you can tailor at different levels. So I was already deep down into the cognitive level. Let's come back out to the program level. Getting people to level 3, there's a pilot program called the Tailored Language Training Initiative, fondly known as TILTI. Last year we had the TILTI pilot. This is being run by ADET, and this year we're doing TILTI 2.0, and CASEL is supporting this work in many ways, including what I'm talking about today.
What is ADET?
ADET, Associate Directorate for Education and Training at NSA. This is borrowed from DLI, actually, but you all know this, that the more advanced you get, the steeper the learning curve. So what we're talking about here is people who are at some combination. These are listening and reading scores. They're at some combination of 2 and 2+, and they need to get to 3. One reason being they get foreign language incentive pay, FLIP. And so this is an opportunity for that. The languages in the pilot program were Chinese, Persian, Farsi, and Russian. And this year we're going to be adding, I haven't seen the final approval, but the discussion is that we'll be adding maybe Spanish, Arabic. Do you remember, Greg? There's another one. Korean, yeah. So we'll be expanding it. So the idea in the TILTI program was to take people off the job for 5 months and put them in training, tailoring the training in any way we could to get them up to level 3 in 2 skills. Okay? So this, in the pilot program, was kind of like try everything you can. So we gave them all sorts of tests, and I'm not going to really talk about all this, just to point out some of the contributions that CASEL had. Oh, I should have said we gave them the language aptitude battery. I should have put that in red as well. We met with the teachers to discuss results to see how they could change their training in their classes. And the folks at ADET, in their language training programs, developed tailored training programs for each individual. What do you need to work on? Listening, reading, vocabulary, at that kind of level, just as you would if you had the opportunity to say, what is the ideal sequence of courses that people need to take? They did that. And then we added another layer on top of it, although this was just trying out the materials. Could we go into the classroom and find a specific problem that we can help with? So now I'm really deep down, and hopefully I'll come back out again. Okay, so what we're envisioning eventually is classroom learning, online learning, and immersion or other experiences. So how can we use the aptitude information for all of these contexts? We're kind of excited about possibly working with BYU on the third one. And in the pilot program, we were looking at classroom learning, and in TILTI 2.0, we'll be looking at online learning. So what we do is we develop tailored materials in a very systematic way, which I'll show you step by step. We look at the language use needs, the language learning problems, and the aptitude profile cards, and try to conduct some studies. So this is really at the proof of concept stage before we do major curriculum revision. And then at the end of TILTI, these were the kinds of evaluations that people took. Some of the results are in. Everybody improved. They went back to their jobs, and they said, one person said, I have new ears, and we have, sort of self-report data like that. The data on the supervisor evaluation will be coming in, and that we're still evaluating the impact on job performance. We have a measure to do that. Mm-hmm.
Are job skills included in this evaluation of the response?
This one, the task-based evaluation of impact. Yeah, so there's something called LPAT, which is the, I can never remember what these things are. Pardon? Right, language performance evaluation tool or something like that. The bottom line is you do some of the things that you do on the job. For example, listen to very rapidly articulated, sometimes difficult to hear speech, transcribe it. Or listen to some material, write a short summary, something like that. So they did pre and post tests of those, and those are still being evaluated. Okay, so at the classroom level, what we're working on is the classic ATI, Aptitude by Treatment Interaction Design, where if you can do this in groups, and at FSI, apparently we will be able to do this in groups if we continue on in this way, because they move people around all the time. They have small classes. Some class isn't working out for them. They move to another one. That's not always possible. But if you can do it, okay, let's measure people's aptitude and put the people with the same aptitude together in a class and teach them that way. This is the experimental design to show that it actually works. So if you're identified as a group A person, you get training A, that should work for you, and training B should not. And the reverse, okay? This is really hard to do in practice so far, but this is the ideal. Okay, so how do we develop our materials? First of all, and this is important, you need to identify, if you're going to do research, okay, if you want to be able to document that it works, and that's where we are right now, we have to be able to demonstrate that it works before it's completely adopted. We need a tractable learning challenge is a better word, or a use problem, something like that. We look at the aptitude profile cards. We think about, okay, this is a particular learning problem. I'm going to give you an example in a minute. What aptitudes might help with that? Because maybe not the whole profile. Consider the practical constraints. How much time do you have? How willing is the teacher to do it? Because we have learned the hard way. You don't get buy-in from the teacher, or you don't have enough time, so forth. It's not going to work. So we do that up front. Then we design the tailored training. We try to get a language outcome measure that's going to determine whether the matched training, the A training, worked for the A people. And then we implement it and measure the results. So this is a sort of graphical version of this, and it's cyclical, iterative, because we're still learning how to do this. So this really is research on the cutting edge, and we're partnering with teachers to do this because we want it to work in the classroom. So these are our practical constraints and things that we think about. Okay, so let me give you an example. This is our, this is one I already gave you, actually. And so it's a real example that you need variability of input, and there are studies to show that people, this is the general story that I told you already, but breaking it out into the details, people with pitch aptitude can pick up tones spoken by different speakers faster than people without. So if you're learning tone, trying to acquire tone, you don't have pitch aptitude, you need to hear the new tones from the same speaker for a longer period of time. And actually, ultimately, you're not going to do as well because there is an absolute component. But if you have pitch aptitude, you need to hear the range of speakers, men, women, children, adults, educated speakers, not educated, as soon as possible because you can handle it. And so you're getting that variability in language, and you can go faster. So there are studies that have demonstrated this. So how can we go beyond that? We started thinking of all the things that we could affect in the curriculum. Variability, use of authentic materials, ratio of L1. This is not so good at FSI because people are experienced language learners, but in other settings, there's a lot of L1 use in the classroom, which might be a problem if people have difficulty inhibiting their L1 when they're trying to use a language. Multimodality and input, there's a lot of research to show that that's a good thing. But if you don't have the aptitude for it, it might not be such a good thing. So there's just some examples, again, going quickly, and please contact me for details. Other things, task characteristics, how much planning time do you need, or can you just do a task off the cuff? That might be determined by your aptitude. Type of feedback, we already talked about. Learning vocabulary, that's an obvious one. Everyone needs to do that. So some people are very good at learning vocabulary explicitly, other people implicitly, and others can do it both ways. And then learning structures, learning foreign sounds. This is all how we're trying to think about it, break it down for the curriculum. A lot of times we don't have yes, we can put everyone with the same aptitude in one class and teach them one way and everyone else another way. So we have to do it within individuals. And so what we typically do is we give every individual both types of training, and then we take measures after each one to see who's benefiting from what. That's somehow a little bit more palatable to others as well, because they know that it won't be too long before you get the training that's matched to your ability. So let me give you an example, getting way down into the weeds here. What we have just done was just reported on yesterday, but I wasn't there. One problem that we have, or one concern that we have, is that we want to try to scale this up. So if I say, here's my language learning problem, I only have it, and you're going to develop a training just for me, well, how useful is that? Because that's very impossible. You can't teach every single person differently. So we're looking for learning problems that generalize across languages that can be handled in the same way. And we're also looking for other ways to scale up, which I'll come back to toward the end. So we started talking with the teachers in the Tilty pilot that I mentioned. And we said, because they're experienced teachers, they've taught people trying to go from 2+ to 3 many, many times. And so they've said, well, they're doing it now and they always do it. They can't hear the words they already know. And so we tried to figure out, what does that mean? And so what it turns out is that where there are words that sound the same, not minimal pairs, sometimes it's minimal pairs, but there can be things with just close approximations, they're still confused. And this happens, if you ask them about them, they can define the words. If somebody's speaking slowly, they have no problems. But as soon as they're in rapidly articulated speech, or any kind of speech that's hard to hear, then they can't, which one was it? Even though they have context, it doesn't help. They write down the wrong word, or they write down the right word, but they write down the wrong translation.
Why does context not work?
That's a good question. That's a very good question. It should work, but it doesn't. This is just an empirical fact. So and then the teachers pointed out to them afterwards, you should have known which word it was. So our hypothesis is it's because the words are not automatically accessible during when there's very high demands in the cognitive task. So that's what we're trying to investigate here. So they can do it when the processing is easy, but as soon as you make it difficult, that confusion keeps popping up. So this was kind of interesting to us because all of the teachers talked about it. So these are some of the reasons which cause confusion. Some were general and some were phonological. Let's see, how much of this am I showing you? So yeah, so this is the problem. They already, they know the words, but they confuse them in real time. And so we're saying, well, the lexical representations must be fully elaborated and automatically accessible. So that's why we call it the fuzzy lexicon study. You need a mental representation that has all of the meanings of a word, all of the semantic associations in a semantic network, and you need to be able to get to it quickly for it to be fully acquired. How do you get there? Well, one idea is spaced practice. I'm not going to develop that too much. But the aptitude interaction we looked at was implicit versus explicit learning strengths.
How did they determine they knew the word or didn't know the word?
Okay, so that's a good question. We did that study. I had the results in there, but I took them out because of time, but I'll explain them to you. We did an item identification task. Actually, I think I have my examples, so yeah, let me put the examples up so you can look at the examples while I'm talking about this. We knew from a dissertation that this phenomenon happens in Russian. We had lots of examples of it, and so hopefully people can read those languages. The English version is parent and parrot. They're similar but different, and sometimes they're confusable. So how did we determine? In Russian, we had a list already from the dissertation. And then we developed a list of possible confusable pairs for Russian, Persian, Farsi, and Mandarin. And then we gave those items to the participants in all of those languages. And we asked them, first of all, to transcribe the word, then translate the word, and then give a confidence rating. How sure are you that you transcribed the right word, and how sure are you that you translated the right word? And we found that, in fact, they are confusing, the things that we thought they would confuse. So if you want the whole list, I can send you, all the Chinese ones.
And they're like parent and parrot. I mean, I don't understand how someone would confuse those words in context.
Right, and the teachers don't understand.
Who's your parent?
Right.
Or who's your parrot?
Yeah. And the thing is that it happens, and the teachers don't understand it either. We've explained it to them, they don't get it.
Parents repeat the same thing all the time.
So it's not a meaning thing, it's a lexical access thing.
But Kathy, you're
Oh.
specifically in this case for people who are at the level 2 or 2+.
Yeah, these are people at level 2+. I should stress that. And so, that's maybe a very simple example. It's just the parent-parent one is just to show you that it's not always minimal pairs. But maybe the Mandarin, that's a tone example, right?
But Liuxing and Liuxing, those would never occur in the same context.
They don't.
Even
and
if somebody
right.
mispronounced it in the context, they would.
That's why it's such a puzzling problem. And so that's why we had to verify that it happened. And it did happen, either in the transcription phase or in the translation phase. So sometimes they wrote down the right word, but they translated it incorrectly,
Maybe it's
or the other way around.
It's the task.
Yeah, so the task is the job task. They have to transcribe. So they have to do this, and that's why.
Maybe one of the reasons why we get the response from students, this text is really confusing. I don't know what's happening.
Yeah.
And that's because, well, logically they couldn't possibly misunderstand it. They have misunderstood it.
Right.
So then a text becomes impenetrable.
Yeah, they missed something. They missed something. Yeah. So it's a really interesting problem. Okay, so I know that I need to move on. Oops, sorry. So that's one example. We had another one where we were looking at Russian case endings. The students were having trouble with that. I can talk about that if people are interested. But now I'm going to move from the Tilty classroom example to online training. Because if we really are going to make this tailored training work, we need to put it online. We're going to do that. We're going to try to do that in Tilty 2.0. And so let me tell you quickly about Language Nation, which is a human language technology enabled platform for adaptive language learning. So adaptivity is where we're going to see the insertion of aptitude information. That's our goal at CASEL. You may be familiar with adaptivity in terms of, okay, give people exercises or activities. If they're not doing well at them, give them more of the same or something easier. Or if they're topping out, give them something harder. That's a common notion. But another way to adapt is to say, I know what the person needs to learn, and I know what the person's aptitude is. I'm going to give them this type of activity to do on the computer. And the goal here, we're partnering with IBM so far. We will be working with other companies. So it's the US government. Oh, let me just go to the, let me not say what the partnerships are because it's on the next slide. But we're drawing on cognitive neuroscience and language learning strategies. That's CASEL. Computer science, math, and big data analytics. That's IBM. And computational linguistics tools, human language tools and technology. That's CASEL and other areas of the government. So since it's a big screen, I hope you can kind of see this. This is the schematic of it. The idea is all of this is going to be automated. This is a big dream, and it's a long-term project. But we are working on some initial first steps, which I'll tell you about. But the idea is that coming from the top, authentic materials from the internet and media, those are going to be fetched and matched to the learner. One way is by level, which Jim has already pointed out to us. It's not ideal because you can do things with text at every level.
What does authentic mean?
Authentic means it hasn't been changed in any way for the purpose of pedagogy.
Language that native speakers would use to speak to other native speakers, not tailored for.
Right.
But not possibly translated, or no?
No. Just
How do you two Russians would say to each other, two
Yeah, how do you know? That's a good
How are you
question.
going to determine that?
How do you, yeah, on the web, that's a good question. How do you know that? But the idea is that
Okay.
we're looking for those things. And we're looking for them automatically. We're going to try to get them relevant to the learner. So what can IBM do already? Topic tracking. So you know what the domain is, as Galal's been talking about. And if we have an idea of what level the learners are at, and we think that's relevant, then we can they can automatically level text. I'm really with Jim that it's not what you always want to do. And the interesting thing is the way they do it is not by looking at all the ILR descriptors. They have an engineering solution. It's a proxy, but it works because it levels the text in the same way that human beings do. But let's assume that they're approximately relevant. Get all those materials, and then we're going to feed in from the bottom cognitive and linguistic learner diagnostics, which will be aptitude, and also where are they maybe on a more fine-grained assessment than DLPT. If we know a trajectory of learning or a sequence of learning, we can measure that. Or we may be finding out about that because the other really exciting thing about this is that all the data and all the interactions will be tracked. And so we will be learning how the students are doing, what problems they're having. We give them tailored training, what works and what doesn't work across this time hundreds or maybe eventually thousands of people. And so we'll be able to demonstrate the aptitude by treatment interactions. Maybe this is too small, but we have coaches from the government, CASELs contributing SLA and HLT tools, and obviously IBM is leading that way. We have some scenarios underway. One is the easy case, because what I learned, this is interdisciplinary, so I learned that what engineers, computational linguistic engineers do is they say, how is this done now? And can we do it a little bit better? Not, here's how we want to do it 10 years from now. Let's take baby steps. So we're starting with a cross-training scenario, level 3 Spanish to level 3 Portuguese in listening and reading faster than is done in the classroom. In the classroom, it takes 5 weeks of full-time study to do that currently. So we're going to try to do that online without a teacher, maybe a coach, just helping out a little bit faster. So we'll see. We should be able to do that because it's not that hard. The next scenario is going to be what we call a surge scenario, and that'll be the language Somali. You take somebody ab initio, get them to level 3 in Somali, and guess what? There are no materials, or very few materials for teaching Somali. So IBM is going to be fetching them, and we're going to be telling them what kinds of activities to do with those materials, including things like text elaboration, but automatic, that Jim was showing us, to deal with the surge scenario. And then the third one is, what is our third one? Somali, oh, Farsi, a Persian Farsi. So that's the maintenance scenario where you're at level 3, or maybe you dip down to level 2 or something like that. And so you need to work online to keep your level 3 language ability. There are a lot of materials for Persian Farsi. Some of our tools that are interesting are, we have something called Did You Mean? So think about the feedback on error that I told you about. Learner types something in and makes a mistake, and we have a morphological analyzer, which is a computational tool which says, if you're a native speaker of English and you thought you heard this in Persian Farsi, you probably heard one of these 4 things, because we know that's the typical type of confusion, such as those that I show you, that learners make. So then we'll, show them those 4 and let them figure out which one it is. What IBM can do is, for example, if you know level 3 Spanish, you really have a leg up on vocabulary in Portuguese. You need to learn about pronunciation differences right away, because that will be a problem for you in listening. Reading, you're already a level 2 in Spanish. So what is it that you have left to do? It's learning the vocabulary that's unique to Portuguese, and you don't get free from Spanish. So that's the type of thing. Some of our dreams, we're going to be supporting interactive, individualized learning opportunities, like with the capabilities that underlie the Watson Jeopardy architecture, questions and answers. So we're interested in that. And then also we're interested in intelligent feedback on error. That's been a sticking point in computer-assisted language learning. How can you really diagnose the error and give the appropriate feedback? Humans are really good at that. Teachers are excellent at it. Computers are terrible at it right now. So that's the long-term problem that we're working on. Okay, so, oh, I just had that in case you couldn't see the other one. So let me sum up now. I don't feel like I'm a fish out of water anymore. I feel like we're all swimming around in a beautiful ocean where there are lots of cognitive abilities that are relevant for jobs and jobs using foreign languages. So I heard yesterday cognitive abilities of problem solving, critical thinking are important. I wanted to add divergent thinking. I think we talked about that. Taking on the mindset of a different culture, solving problems that way. We are working on CASTLE at measuring aptitudes for those things. And we're also working on how to, also language aptitude. We're working on ways to boost cognitive aptitude and cognitive language aptitude. One example is working memory training, especially the one that's updating, where you take, you've got information in your short-term memory store. You've got to let some of it go because you need new and more relevant information to help you with the cognitive task at hand, like mapping a form, a meaning, and a function in language. We can train that. We've shown that we can train that, at least to the level of helping people with resolving ambiguity in language. And we have studies underway now to show that this will actually result in an outcome in language learning. So I think that we're really all talking about the same thing. How does our brain work generally and in language-specific ways? And of course, all of those things are trained in the humanities. Okay, so yeah, I just brought that thought back again. And then my last slide is this, what's coming up. I mentioned that we delivered HiLab on the web. We actually did deliver it just the end of this month, so that's there. We're working with MIT to map the brain regions to HiLab. So maybe someday you won't have to do even a 90-minute test. You'll just go in and have your brain scanned and we'll say, there's your aptitude. But I think that's a few years down the road. We're working on this is the tone test. We're engineering cross-training, and we're working on adaptive language nation. So I'll stop there and take questions.